Okay, let's talk about getting back to overhead movements postpartum. Super exciting. A lot of times we really want to get back to things like jerks and overhead movements into our postpartum period, but we have a couple of things that we need to consider and some modifications that we may need to make early on postpartum before we layer on things like weight, impact, and volume. So the first thing is the change in our body. We are not the same as we were pre-pregnancy. Our body has shifted a lot during our pregnancy. And during pregnancy, we slowly get to kind of shift and change as our body changes and grows. We very quickly see that shift back with the exit of the baby during labor and delivery. What that means is that you can often feel very off balance when you get back, especially to overhead movements, because more than we think, it requires a lot of core strength and stability to maintain our position, to drive force up against a dumbbell or a barbell with different amounts of speed. And so we need to make sure we focus a lot on getting that back. The second thing is that our body, to compensate for the growing baby bump, goes into a bit of this hyperextension or increased lumbar lordosis. And we need to reestablish that pattern again postpartum. What that means is we really want to consider keeping our ribs stacked over our pelvis and not overarch as we're pressing up overhead. That's going to be our kind of check before we lift is our ribs stacked over our pelvis. Just like many of the other barbell movements, we're going to be manipulating breath early postpartum before we stack or layer in returning to things like Valsalva or using a weightlifting belt. For the overhead movements, that means breathing out as the bar goes up overhead, and then again layering in that impact. Very early on, we can get back to some overhead movements by doing seated variations. Pelvis is anchored to the bench, core is less needed, still a little bit, but less. And we can get back to those movements relatively early, especially at low loads. From there, we go to our standing strict variations, push press variations, and then we start layering in impact with things like no feet push jerks, move the feet or full push jerks, and then going into those split stance variations. We're gonna go through all of these examples further on in the video, but that's just kind of a grand overview of some of the things that we're considering postpartum. Finally, things that are essentially our do not pass go are if we're feeling any heaviness or bulging in the vaginal area that may be indicative of something like a prolapse, any pain in the pelvic girdle into the low back that's basically telling us that we're maybe at a threshold of volume or load or impact that our body isn't ready for. The third final thing is potentially any leaking. So urine, stool, flatulence, those types of things, again, are a pressure threshold issue where, again, our body is telling us that maybe we're moving a little bit like past where we should be going at this time, and let's cool it for a little bit. Let's not go a little bit further with that. Final thing that could potentially come into the postpartum piece is any of that coning or doming indicative of diastasis recti as your rectus muscles are starting to come together postpartum. This would usually be indicative of an extension fault where you're hyperextending and putting more pressure on your interior wall. If you are stacked rib over pelvis, that diastasis rectus abdominis issue is generally not as much of an influencing factor in how you would modify or progress postpartum.